page 542. And just to think that we had dreamed of resting and loosening up a bit in port, after being squashed and doubled up for several days in the Stolypin, how we had dreamed of the transit prison, that we could stretch out a bit there and straighten up, that we would be able to go to the toilet there without hurrying, that we would drink as much water there as we wanted and get as much hot water for tea, that there we wouldn't be forced to ransom our own bread rations from the convoy with our own belongings, that we would be fed hot food there, and that at last we would be taken to the bath, that we could drench ourselves in hot water and stop itching. We had had elbows stuck into our sides and been tossed from side to side in the Black Maria, and they had shouted at us, "Link arms, take hold of your heels." But we were in good spirits anyway. It was all right. Soon we would be at the transport prison. And now we were there. And even if some part of our dreams came true in the transit prison, something else would follow all up anyway. What awaits us in the bath, you can never be sure. They begin suddenly to shave off all the women's hair off. In Krasnaya Presnya, November 1950. Or a line of us naked men is clipped by women barbers only. In the Vologda steam room, portly Aunt Motia used to shout, "Stand up, men," and she let the whole line have it from the steam pipe. And the Irkutsk transit prison argued differently. It's more natural for the entire service staff in the bath to be male, and for a man to smear on the medicinal tar ointment between the women's legs, or during the winter in the cold soaping up room of the Novosibirsk transit prison. Only cold water comes from the faucets. The prisoners made up their minds to ask higher-ups, and a captain comes, puts his own hand unfastidiously under the faucet. "I say this water is hot, get it?" I have already wearied of reporting that there are baths which have no water at all, that they scorch clothes in the roaster, that after the bath they compel people to run naked and barefoot through the snow to get their things. The counterintelligence of the Second Belarusian Front in Brodnica, 1945. From your very first steps in the transit prison, you realize that here you are not in the hands of the jailers or the officers of the prison administration, who at least adhere to some of the time to some kind of written law. Here you are in the hands of the trustees. That surly bath attendant who comes to meet your prisoner transport, well, go wash, gentlemen fascists. And that work assignment clerk with a plywood writing board who looks over your formation searchingly and hurries you up. And that instructor, clean-shaven except for a prominent forelock, who slaps his leg with that rolled-up newspaper and at the same time gives your bags a once-over. And then other transit prison trustees, whom you don't recognize, penetrate your suitcases with X-ray eyes. Oh, how alike they all are. And where in your brief prison transport journey have you seen all of them before? Not so clean-looking, not so well-washed, but the same kind of ugly mug swine with pitiless, bare-toothed grins. Bah, these are the same Blatnia, the thieves again, those same Irky croaks from Leonid Utisov, glorifies in his songs. Here again are Jenka Zhogol, Seryoga, Zivir, and Demika Kishkenya, but not behind bars this time. They have been cleaned up, dressed up as representatives of the state, and putting on airs of great importance. They see to it that discipline is observed by us, and if one peers into those notes, one can even, with imagination, picture that they sprang from the same Russian roots as the rest of us. That once upon a time there were village boys whose fathers bore names such as Klim, Prokhor, Guri, and that their general structure is even similar to our own. 2 nostrils, 2 irises in the eyes, a rosy tongue with which to swallow food, and utter certain Russian sounds, which, however, shape totally new words. Every chief of a transit prison, has enough presence of mind to realize that he can send his relatives back home, all the wages for all staff positions, or else he can divvy them up with other prison officers. All you have to do is whistle to get as many volunteers as you want among the socially friendly prison elements to carry out all that work, just in return for being allowed. Just in return for being allowed to cast anchor at the transit prison and not have to go to the mine or to the taiga. All these work assignment clerks, office clerks, bookkeepers, instructors, bath attendants, barbers, stockroom clerks, cooks, dishwashers, laundresses, tailors who repair underwear and linens, are permanent transit prison residents. They receive prison rations and are registered in cells, and they swipe the rest of their soup and chow on their own, out of the common food pot, or out of the bundles of the transit sex. All these transit prison trustees regard it as certain they will never be better off in any camp. We arrive in their hands, still not completely plucked, and they bamboozle us to their heart's content. It is they and not the jailers who search us and our belongings here, and before they search, they suggest we turn in our money for safekeeping, and they seriously write down a list. We never see the list or the money again. We turned in our money. Who to? The officer who has arrived on the scene asks in surprise. Well, it was one of them. Who exactly? The trustee hadn't noticed which one. Why did you turn it over to him? We thought. That's what the turkey thought. Think less and you'll be better off. And that's that. They suggest we leave our things in the vestibule to the bath. No one's going to take them. Who needs them? We leave them. For, after all, we can't take them into the bath with us anyway. We return and there are no sweaters left and no fur-lined mittens. What kind of sweater was it? Grayish. Well, that means it went to the laundry. They also take things from us honestly in return for taking the suitcase into the storage room for safekeeping, for putting us in a cell without the thieves, for sending us off on prisoner transport as soon as possible, for not sending us off as long as possible. The only thing they don't do is rob us by main force out in the open. But those aren't thieves. The connoisseurs among us explain, these are the bitches, the ones who work for the prison. They are the enemies of the honest thieves. And the honest thieves are the ones imprisoned in cells. But somehow it's hard for our rabbity brains to grasp. Their ways are the same. They have the same kind of tattoos. Many are really the enemies of our. Maybe they really are enemies of those others. But after all, they are not our friends either. That's how it is. And by the time they have forced us to sit down in the yard, right beneath the cell windows, the windows all have muzzles on them, and you can't look in, but from inside, hoarse, friendly voices advise, "Hey fellows, you know what they do here when they search you? They take away everything loose like tea and tobacco. If you have any, toss it here through the window. I'll give it back later." So what do you know? We are suckers and rabbits. Maybe they do take tea and tobacco away. We have read about universal prisoner solidarity in all our great literature. That one prisoner won't deceive another. The way that they spoke to us was friendly. "Hey, fellows." And so we toss them our tobacco pouches, and the genuine, purebred thieves on the other side catch them and guffaw. "You fascist dupes." And here are the slogans with which the whole transit prison welcomes us, even though they don't actually hang them on the walls. "Don't look for justice here. You're going to have to hand over everything you've got to us. You'll have to give it all up." This is repeated to you by the jailers, the convoy, and the thieves. You are overwhelmed by your unbearable prison term, and you're trying to figure out how to catch your breath, while everyone around you is figuring out how to plunder you. Everything works out so as to oppress the political prisoner, who is already dressed up and abandoned. Without all that, you will have to give it all up. The jailer at the Gorky transit prison shakes its head hopelessly, and with a sense of relief, Ernst Bernstein gives him his officer's greatcoat, not free but in exchange for 2 onions. And why should you complain about the thieves if you see all the jailers at Krasnaya Presnya wearing chrome leather boots? They were never issued. They were all lifted by the thieves in the cells and then pushed to the jailers. Why complain about the thieves if the instructor of the cultural and educational department of the camp administration is a Blatnoy, a thief himself, and writes reports on politicals? The camp transit prison. And how are you ever going to get justice against the thieves in the Rostov transit prison when this is their ancient native tribal den? They say that in 1942 at the Gorky transit prison, some officer prisoners, including Gavrilov, military engineer Shipitin, and others, nonetheless rebelled, beat up the thieves, and forced them to stay in line. But this is always regarded as a legend. Did the thieves capitulate in just one of those cells for long? And how was it that the blue caps allowed the socially hostile elements to beat up the socially friendly ones? And when they say that at the Colchis transit prison in 1940, the thieves started to grab money right out of the hands of the politicals lined up, the commissary and the politicals began to beat them up so badly that they couldn't be stopped, and the perimeter guards entered the compound with machine guns to defend the thieves. Now there's something that rings true. That's the way it really was. Foolish relatives, they dash about in freedom, borrow money, because they never have that kind of money at home, and send you foodstuffs and things. The widow's last mite, but also a poisoned gift because it transforms you from a free thought hungry person into one who is anxious and cowardly, and it deprives you of that newly dawning enlightenment, a toughening resolve, which are all you need for your descent into the abyss. O wise gospel saying about the camel and the eye of the needle, these material things will keep you from entering the heavenly kingdom of the liberated spirit. And you see that others in the police van have the same kind of bags as you, ragbag bastards, and the thieves have already snarled at you in Black Maria. But there were only 2 of them, and there were 50 of you, and so far they haven't touched you. And now they were holding us for the 2nd day at the Krasnaya Presnya station with our legs tucked beneath us on the dirty floor because we were so crowded. However, none of us was observing that life was going on around us, because we were all too concerned about how to turn in our suitcases for safekeeping, even though we were supposed to have the right to return in our things for safekeeping. Nonetheless, the only reason the work assignment clerks permitted us to do it was because the prison was a Moscow prison and we ourselves hadn't yet lost our Moscow look. What a relief. Our things had been checked, and that meant we would have to give them up, not at this transit prison, but later on. The only things left dangling from our hands were our bundles with our ill-fated foodstuffs. Too many of us beavers had been assembled in one place. They began to distribute us among different cells. I was shoved into a cell with that same Valentin whom I had spent the first day, whom I had been with the day I signed for my OSO sentence, and who had proposed with a touching sentiment that we begin a new life in camp. It was not yet packed full. The aisle was free. There was plenty of space under the bunks. According to the traditional arrangement, the thieves occupied the second-tier bunks. The senior members were beside the windows, their juniors further back. A neutral gray mass was on the lower bunks. No one attacked us. Without looking around and without thinking ahead, inexperienced as we were, we sat down on the asphalt floor and crawled under our bunks. We would even be cozy there. The bunks were low for big men to get under, and we had to slide in on our bellies, inching along the asphalt floor. We did, and we were going to lie there quietly and talk quietly. Not a chance. In the semi-darkness, with the wordless rustling now from all sides, juveniles crept up on us on all fours like big rats. They were still boys, some 12 years old even, but the criminal code accepted them too. They had already been processed through a thieves' trial, and they were continuing their apprenticeship with the thieves here. They had been unleashed on us. They jumped us from all sides, and 6 pairs of hands stripped from us and wrenched from under us all our wealth. All this took place in total silence, with only the sound of sinister sniffing, and we were trapped. We couldn't get up, we couldn't move. It took no longer than a minute for them to seize the bundles with the fat bacon, sugar, and bread. They were gone. We lay there feeling so stupid. We had given up our food without a fight, and we could go on lying there now, but that was utterly impossible. Creeping out awkwardly, rear-ends first, we got up from under the bunks. Am I a coward? I had thought I wasn't one. I had pushed my way into the heat of a bombing in the open steppe. I had been afraid to drive over a trail obviously mined with anti-tank mines. I hadn't been afraid. I had remained cool-headed when I let my battery out of encirclement and went back in for a damaged command car. Why then, at that moment, didn't I grab one of those human rats and grate his rosy face on the black asphalt? Was he too small? Well, then go for their leaders. But no. At the front we are strengthened by some kind of supplementary awareness, and quite false too, perhaps. It is a sense of our military unity, the sense of being in the right place at the right time, of duty. But this new situation, nothing is clear. There are no rules, and everything has to be learned by feel. Getting to my feet, I turned to their senior, the Pakin, and the ringleader of the thieves. All the stolen victuals were there in front of him, and beside the window, on the second-tier bunks, the juvenile rats hadn't eaten a thing themselves. They were disciplined. Nature had sculpted the front part of the ringleader's head in bipeds, usually called a face, with nausea and hate. Or perhaps It had come to be that way, come to be what it was from living the life of a beast of prey. It sagged crookedly and loosely, with a low forehead, a savage scar, and modern steel crowns on the front teeth. His little eyes were exactly large enough to see familiar objects, and yet not to take delight in the beauties of the world. He looked at me as a boar looks at a deer, knowing he could always knock me off my feet. He was waiting, and what did I do? Leap forward to smash my fist in that ugly mug at least once, and then go down in the aisle? Alas, I did not. Am I a scoundrel? Until that moment I had always thought that I wasn't. But now, plundered and humiliated, I found it offensive to get down flat on my stomach again and crawl back to the bunks. And so I addressed the ringleader of the thieves indignantly, and told him that since he had taken our food away from us, that he might at least give us a place on the bunk. No, just tell me, wasn't that a natural complaint for a city dweller and an officer? And what happened then? The ringleader of the thieves agreed. After all, I was thereby surrendering my claim to the fat bacon, and I was thereby recognizing his superior authority, and I was revealing a point of view in common with his. He too would have driven off the weakest, and he gave orders for 2 of the gray neutrals to get off the lower bunks beside the window, and to free space for us. They obeyed submissively, and we lay down in the best places. For a while we still grieved over our loss. The thieves paid no attention to my military breeches. They weren't their kind of uniform. But one of the thieves was already fingering Valentin's woolen trousers. He liked them, woolen trousers. And it was only at night that the reproachful whisper of our neighbors reached us. How could we ask the thieves to help us by driving 2 of our own people under the bunks in our place? And only then did awareness of my own meanness prick my conscience and make me blush. And for many years thereafter, I blushed every time I remembered it. The great prisoners on the lower bunk were my own brothers, 581B, the POWs. Had I not, just a short while ago, sworn to assume the burden of their fate, and then I shunted them off under the bunks? Truly, they hadn't done anything to defend us against the thieves. But why should they have fought for our fat bacon, if we ourselves did not? They had had enough cruel fights back in POW camp to destroy their faith in decency, but they hadn't done me any harm, and I had them. And thus it is that we have to keep getting banged on flank and snout again and again, so as to become, in time at least, human beings. Yes, human beings. But even for the newcomer whom the transport prison cracks open and shucks, it is very, very necessary. It gives him some gradual preparation for camp life. Such a change, all in one step, would be more than the heart could bear. His consciousness would be unable to orient itself in that murk all at once. It has to happen gradually. Then, too, the transit prison gave the prisoner the semblance of communicating with home. It was there he wrote his first letter he was permitted to, reporting that he hadn't been shot, and sometimes the direction of his prisoner transport, and these were always the first unfamiliar words. Home of a man who had been plowed over by interrogation. At home, they continued to remember him as he had been, but he would never be that person again. And that could suddenly, like a stroke of lightning, become apparent in one or another clumsily written line, clumsily written because even though letters could be sent from transit prisons and there are mailboxes in the yard, it was impossible to get either paper or pencils or anything to sharpen a pencil with. However, Makorka wrapper, excuse me, or one from a sugar packet would turn up and be smoothed out, and someone in the cell would have a pencil, and so lines would be written in an undecipherable scrawl, which would determine the family's future peace or discord. Women driven out of their minds by receiving such a letter would sometimes precipitately rush off and try to get their husbands at the transit prison, even though visits were never allowed, and they would have succeeded only in burdening him with things. One such woman provided, in my opinion, the theme for a monument to all wives, and even indicated the place for it. This was in the Kubyshev transit prison in 1950. The prison was situated in a low-lying area, from which, however, the GULag gates and the Volga River could be seen. And right above the prison, bordering it on the east, rose a high, long, grassy hill. It was outside the camp compound and above it, and from the outside and down below we couldn't see the approach to it. Very rarely did anyone ever appear up there, although sometimes goats were pastured there or children played, and one cloudy summer day a city woman appeared on its ridge. Shading her eyes with her hand and barely moving, she began to scan our compound from above. At the time, 3 heavily populated cells were taking their outdoor walk in 3 exercise yards separate. And there in the abyss, among those 300 depersonalized ants, she hoped to catch sight of her man. Did she hope that her heart would tell her which one he was? In all probability, they had refused to allow her a visit with him, and so she had climbed that hill. Everyone noticed her from the courtyards, and everyone stared at her. Down below in the hollow there was no wind, but it was blowing hard up above. It made her long dress, her jacket, and her long hair stream out and billow, expressing all that love and anxiety which possessed her. I think that a statue of such a woman, right there on that spot on the hill overlooking the transit prison, with her face to the GULag gates, just as she actually stood, might explain at least a little something to our grandchildren. She was there for a long time and they didn't drive her off, probably because the guards were too lazy to climb up the hill. But finally a soldier climbed up and began to shout and wave his hands at her and chased her away. The transit prison also gives prisoners some kind of overall view, some breadth of outlook. And they say even though there's something to eat, life still it's a gay life. Even though there's nothing to eat, still it's a gay life. In the incessant traffic here, in the comings and goings of dozens of hundreds of people, in the frankness of the stories and conversations. In camp they don't talk so freely because they're always afraid they're stepping into a trap of the Oprah, the security officer. You are refreshed, you are aired out, you become more lucid, and you begin to understand better what is happening to you, to your people, even to the world. Even one single eccentric who turns up in your cell can tell you things you'll never in your life read about. All of a sudden they introduce into the cell some kind of miracle, a tall young military man with a Roman profile, curly and unclipped flaxen locks, in a British uniform, just as if he had come straight from the Normandy landing, an officer of the invading army. He enters as proudly as if he expected everyone to rise to their feet in his presence, and it turns out that he had. simply not expected to be among friends at this point. He had already been in prison for 2 years, but he had never been in a cell, and he had been brought secretly right to the transit prison itself, in an individual stall-up-in compartment, and then, unexpectedly, either by mistake or else with special intent, he had been admitted to our common stable, and looked around the cell, saw a Wehrmacht officer there in German uniform, and started to argue with him in German. And there they were arguing heatedly, ready, it seemed, to resort to weapons if they'd had any. 5 years had passed since the war, and it had been drummed into us that in the West the war had been waged only for the sake of appearances, and to us it was strange to observe their mutual outrage. The German had been with us for a long time, and we Russians hadn't argued with them. For the most part, we had laughed with him. No one would have believed the story of Eric Arvid Andersen, had it not been for his unshorn locks, a miracle unique in all GULag. And that foreign bearing of his, and his fluent English, German, and Swedish speech, according to him, he was the son of a rich Swede, not merely a millionaire, but a billionaire. Well, let's assume he embellished a little. On his mother's side, he was a nephew of the British General Robertson, who commanded the British zone in occupied Germany. A Swedish subject, he had served as a volunteer in the British Army and had actually landed in Normandy after the war. And after the war, he had become a Swedish career officer. However, the investigation of social systems remained one of his principal interests. His thirst for socialism was stronger than his attachment to his father's capital. He looked upon Soviet socialism with feelings of profound sympathy, and had even had the chance to become convinced of its flourishing state with his own eyes, when he had come to Moscow as a member of the Swedish military delegation. They had been given banquets and taken to country homes, and there they had encountered no obstacles at all to establishing contact with ordinary Soviet citizens, with pretty actresses who for some reason never had to rush off to work and who were willing to spend time with them, even tete-a-tete. And thus convinced once and for all of the triumph of our social system, Eric, on his return to the West, wrote articles in the press defending and praising Soviet socialism, and this proved to be its undoing. In those years, in 1947-48, they were roping in from all sorts of nooks and crannies progressive young Westerners prepared to renounce the West publicly, and it appeared that if they could only have collected another dozen or so, the West should shudder and collapse. Eric's newspaper articles caused him to be regarded as suitable for this category, and at the time he was serving in West Berlin, and he had left his wife in Sweden, and out of the pardonable male weaknesses, he used to visit an unmarried German girl in East Berlin. And it was there that he was bound and gagged one night. And is not this the significance of the proverb which says, quote, he went to see his cousin and ended up in prison, unquote. This has probably been going on for a long time, and he wasn't the first. It took him to Moscow, where Gromyko, who had once dined at his father's home in Stockholm, and who knew the son also, not only returned the hospitality, but proposed to the young man that he renounce publicly both capitalism and his own father, and in return, he was promised full and complete capitalist maintenance to the end of his days here in our country. But to Gromyko's surprise, although Eric would not have suffered any material loss, he became indignant and uttered some very insulting words. Since they didn't believe in his strength of mind, they locked him up in a dacha outside Moscow, fed him like a prince in a fairy tale, sometimes They used awful methods of repression on him. They refused to accept his orders for the following day's menu, and instead of the spring chicken he ordered, they simply brought him a steak, just like that. Surrounded him with the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and waited for a year for him to be re-educated. To their surprise, it didn't happen, and at that point they quartered him with a former lieutenant general who had already served 2 years in Norilsk. They probably calculated that by relating the horrors of camp to the lieutenant general would persuade Eric to surrender. But either he carried out that assignment badly, or else he didn't want to carry it out. After 10 months of their being imprisoned together, the only thing he had taught Eric was broken Russian, and he had bolstered Eric's growing repugnance for the Blue Caps. In the summer of 1950, they once more summoned Eric to Vyshinsky, and he once more refused. In doing so, he made existence contingent on consciousness, thereby violating all the Marxist-Leninist rules. And then Abakumov himself read Eric the decree. 20 years in prison. What for? Excuse me. What for? They themselves already regretted having gotten mixed up with this ignoramus, but at the time they couldn't release him and let him go back to the West, and so they transported him in a separate compartment, and it was there that he had heard a story of the Moscow girl through the partition, and seen through the train window in the dawn light the rotting straw-thatched roofs of the old age Russia of Ryazan. Those 2 years had very strongly confirmed in him his loyalty to the West. He believed blindly in the West. He did not want to reconsider his weaknesses. He considered Western armies unbeatable and Western political leaders faultless. He refused to believe us when we told him that during the period of his imprisonment, Stalin had begun a blockade of Berlin and had gotten away with it perfectly well. Eric's milky neck and creamy cheeks blushed with indignation. Whether we ridiculed Churchill and Roosevelt, and he was also certain that the West would not countenance Eric's imprisonment, that on the basis of information from the Kubyshev transit prison, Western intelligence services would immediately learn that Eric had not drowned in the Spree River but had been imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and either he would be ransomed or someone would be exchanged for him. This faith of his in the individual importance of his own fate among other prisoner states was reminiscent of our own well-intentioned Orthodox Soviet communists. Notwithstanding our heated arguments, he invited my friends and me to Stockholm whenever we would come. Everyone knows us there, he said with a tired smile. My father virtually maintains the Swedish king's whole court. For the time being, however, the son of a billionaire had nothing to dry himself with, and I presented him with an extra tattered towel as a gift. And soon they took him away on a prisoner transport. And the movement of people was endless. Prisoners were brought in and taken away singly and in groups, and driven off in prison transports, appearing so businesslike on the surface, so planned. This movement was marked by such stupidity that one can hardly believe it. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.